Hi, I'm Sherry and this is Gardening in the North. Today I wanted to share with you some of my experience and knowledge of the asparagus plant and why you should plant it now so that you can have food for years to come. The asparagus plant is a perennial, and what this means is that you're going to plant it once and it's going to come back every year for roughly 15 to 20 years. What that means for you is that you plant it now and reap the benefits for years to come. You want to plant your asparagus plants in early spring. Basically, as soon as you're able to move that soil around, that's when you should plant them. Now, some varieties will allow you to plant from seed. The ones behind me here were all planted from asparagus crowns. And what that means is that I actually had the roots that I was able to plant. And I got those from my local nursery for 50 cents each. It was a steal. I bought 40 of them, which means that I have 40 plants behind me that cost me $20. And for the next 15 to 20 years, they're going to produce asparagus for my family. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that planting asparagus is a time commitment. It's not something that you're going to reap benefits from next year. So there is a bit of a process to it. The first year that you plant asparagus, you may get a couple spears that come up, but they're going to be super thin. And you really don't want to harvest those ones because they're too thin and the plant hasn't grown to its maturity under the ground yet. That the root system hasn't strengthened up. And so you want to make sure that you're not cutting those really thin asparagus spears and damaging those roots. Now, year two, you will most likely get some asparagus, and you can cut the asparagus that are about, I wouldn't go any thinner than your pinky, but even that is a little thin. Now, the idea is that each crown, year two, will probably push up maybe a handful of spears. And so what I would suggest to you is that you're able to cut maybe half of those spears for each plant that you've planted. Let the rest of them go to fern. They need to be able to go to fern in order to have the photosynthesis process start. They need that, otherwise the root system will die. Now, year three, that's the money maker. Now you're going to be able to cut a lot more because they're also going to be thicker and there will be more of them. So year three is the year for quantity and quality. Now, having said that, you also want to remember that you don't want to take all the spears. If you take all the spears, then that photosynthesis process isn't going to happen. And that means the following year, you won't get anything from that plant because you've essentially killed it. So let's talk about where you're going to plant your asparagus, because this is a very serious decision to make. You want to plant your asparagus in an area that you're okay with those plants multiplying. And the reason I say that is those crowns, that root system underneath your mulch and your soil is actually, it has the potential to grow 6 feet long. So you could potentially plant a crown right here where I am right now, and 6 feet from where I'm sitting, spears could come up. So you have to make sure that where you plant them, if that was to happen, you'd be okay with it. The other reason is because those spears that you don't cut from the plant are actually going to grow into ferns. And these ferns can actually grow to be 4 to 7 feet. So what that means for you is that if you decide you're going to plant your asparagus somewhere because you think, I'm okay with, my asparagus multiplying in that area, and beside the asparagus, you plant something that requires sun, and it's on the side of the asparagus that is going to be blocked by the sun, then you're going to be really disappointed with whatever it is that you planted next to the asparagus. So an example of that would be that right behind my asparagus patch here, I planted onions last year. I did about 350 onions all along the back, right on the border of my property line. And I didn't realize how big these ferns were going to get, because the first year there weren't as many of them and they weren't as bushy and they didn't get as tall. Last year, not only did they get big and bushy, but they fell over and actually laid down on the onions. So needless to say, I didn't get very many onions last year because of where I planted them. Now, I planted them, just to give you a sense of direction, behind me is east. So I planted them on the east side of these asparagus. And again, they didn't do well. This year, I took a little bit of a different tact and I planted my onions on the west side of the asparagus, because I knew that as the sun rose up and went around to the west, that my onions would get a lot of sun. And they did well. Now, you need to consider that, and you need to consider the fact that these ferns get very, very bushy. So if you think that you're going to be able to squeeze them in somewhere, you might want to reconsider your decision on where you're planting them. I wanted to give you an idea of how tall they actually can grow, keeping in mind that in earlier videos that I showed you, I ended up with a lot of tomato plants. And because of that, I ended up having to plant tomato plants where I wouldn't necessarily plant them. And one of those places was on the east side of my asparagus ferns. Now, I did mention in those videos that those plants did not grow, probably not even half the size of the rest of my plants that were able to get a lot more sun. And so one of the things that I did do in the hopes of, making sure that the sun could get those plants is I started bending down some of the ferns. So rather than having them grow to be, 5 to 7 feet tall, I was actually bending them down, and then I roped them off so that they wouldn't fall over and land on my tomato plants. Now, right behind me, you can see that one of the ferns has grown past me. Now, I'm 5'4", so the one behind me is about 6 feet tall, just to give you an idea. This here is a look at the ferns from the east side. And so you can see that there is a small walking path between the asparagus ferns and the really little tomato plants. Now you'll also see that I have roped off the ferns in an effort to hold them up. Some of them are turning brown, and that is because early on I actually bent them over, like I mentioned, in an effort to allow the sun to get at my tomato plants. Like everything, there are female and male asparagus ferns. Now the female ones are the ones that produce these little red berries. And these little red berries are actually seeds. And so what you need to do is you need to collect them, lay them out on a paper towel until they all dry up, and then you're going to squeeze them between your fingers to remove the seed from the skin. I wanted to show you what was inside those little red berries. And so I squeezed one of them and I found 2 little black seeds inside it. And so there you go. Now, they're probably comparable to maybe a radish seed. Radish seeds are a little bit bigger, maybe even close to a beet seed. So they're not overly small like a tomato seed or a pepper seed. And they have some substance to them. It's like a hard little stone almost. So what I'm going to do with these is in February or March, I'm actually going to plant these and put them under grow lights and see if I can germinate them. If I can germinate them into little seedlings, then sometime mid-June, I will bring them out and I will plant these, keep an eye on them, knowing that the patch behind me is already 3 years old and asparagus lasts 15 to 20 years. So I potentially have anywhere from 12 to 15 years left on this patch. So my thoughts are, why not start another one if I can for free? And if it works, then essentially I could end up with another 10 asparagus plants, and again, all for the low cost of $20 that I initially paid for the ones behind me. So some of the things that we made with our asparagus this year was asparagus soup, which is amazing. I used our asparagus with eggs and omelets. We actually ate a lot of asparagus raw. We just dunked it into hummus. So there are amazing things that you can do with asparagus out there. And I can't stress enough that why wouldn't you plant asparagus today so that you can reap the benefits for years to come? Thanks for spending time in my garden. Asparagus plants will multiply. The root system underneath the ground, where you can't see it, is actually going to increase. Oh my God, it's like rubbing on me and I'm like freaking out.